Hello, everyone. It's Andrew here, and today I want to talk about how I think of the Star Wars trilogies. This is particularly relevant to the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy. And what I mean by this is I personally view them as different continuities. So to kind of explain what I mean by different continuities a little bit, the idea of a continuity is like this is a a linear progression, or how things connect together, how they're continuous, which is, are things linking up in a way? Like, mathematically, the idea of continuity with a graph is, does it connect, or is there, like, gaps and stuff? And I think there might be some stuff with smoothness, too. I don't remember. But basically, it's like, how well do things connect up and all that sort of stuff. And so when I say they're different continuities, I basically am saying I don't feel like the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy hook up. I think that they're talking about like connected set of events, but the way I kind of described it when I was discussing the different trilogies with my sister the other day is that I feel like the prequel trilogy and the original trilogy, like, you can understand how they're supposed to connect together, but the plugs are different shapes. They don't quite actually connect. Whereas with the original trilogy and the Disney trilogy, what are we calling it? The Abrams-Ryan thing? Anyway, Force Awakens, Last Jedi, and whatnot, I don't see how they connect. Like, I can see that they could connect, but, like, there's a bunch missing, and I understand that they need a gap of time, but they needed to tell me in episode 7, they needed to explain what happened between 6 and 7 to get us to the world setting that we have in 7, but that's a completely different discussion. So particularly focusing, again, on the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy, I don't see how they're, like, I can see how they, like, temporally connect up, where the prequel trilogy is clearly talking about events that precede the original trilogy. But the reason why I feel like they're different continuities, that they're kind of like alternate universes, I guess you could say. So it's talking about one set of a set of events that happen in one, and then shift forward and across alternate realities to get to the other one, or backwards, depending upon which order you're looking at things. Is the reason why I view them that way is because there's so much different in how things feel. The feeling of things doesn't quite make sense, and there's some weird stuff with, like, how old is Obi-Wan really? Like, I feel like Obi-Wan's age is kind of wonky. But anyway. So with the feel of the original trilogy, and particularly the scene that always comes to my mind when I think about this this continuity thing, the continuity of, I don't know, tone, aesthetic, the sense of how things hook up, is that scene where in Star Wars, I guess A New Hope, where Obi-Wan and Luke are talking in Obi-Wan's hut on Tatooine. It's fairly early in the movie. And Obi-Wan is reminiscing, discussing sort of Anakin Skywalker, Luke's father, and the time that was before. And the way that he described stuff really felt to me like he was discussing a very different character than we got. Like, the Anakin that we got in the prequel trilogy technically checked off a number of the boxes, but the feeling of how those things felt to me felt very different. So to me, the sort of character that he's describing felt much more of an adult, much more Han Solo-like. And then another thing that's a huge continuity gap for me is the way that Obi-Wan discusses the Jedi Order and the way that Jedi work in the original trilogy feels very different from the way it's presented and functions in the prequel trilogy. And the prequel trilogy, the Jedi are highly organized, they have a very strong monastic structure, all this sort of stuff. With the temple on Coruscant and the huge involvement in politics and all of those sorts of things. in the original trilogy, the way that things are described, it makes it feel much more ad hoc. In particular, the way that Obi-Wan says that I thought I could train Anakin just as well as Yoda could. I was wrong, right? Something to that basic effect. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but he basically says a line like that. And the way that he describes that makes it sound like the Jedi are a lot more ad hoc. There's like known masters and like really talented Jedi, but that they don't have a rigid structure. They're not ordered. Like, is there an argument that Anakin wouldn't have been trained at all by Yoda at the time he was at the temple, and as presented in the prequel trilogy? Like, he clearly had interactions with Yoda. He knew who Yoda was. He'd learned from him. There's a sense in the original trilogy that Darth Vader doesn't know Yoda exists, right? He never discusses. He always is like, Obi-Wan, Obi-Wan, Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan trained you. And so all of these sort of clues, and like I said, it feels to me like in the original trilogy that Yoda trained Obi-Wan, not Qui-Gon. Qui-Gon is obviously not mentioned in the original trilogy. That Obi-Wan trained from him, that he encountered Anakin probably as part of the war. Not all Jedi would necessarily have been involved in the Clone Wars. Like, the whole feeling of everything that came before is very different than what's presented in the prequel trilogy. And there's also the aesthetic discontinuity where, I mean, let's face it, the original trilogy had a lot of matte, a lot of not shiny. Like, the CGI is very shiny, it's very bright, there's a lot more lights and that sort of stuff. The feeling of Star Wars, in terms of the environments, to me, changes. And a lot of this is technology, right? But it changes between the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy as well. And that sort of like aesthetic break also is part of what contributes to continuity break, but just the feeling of what things were like previously as they're discussed in the original trilogy feels very different. It feels like the Clone Wars were supposed to be longer ago. And I don't know, just the whole break from everything. And like, even when Leia's talking about her mother, it sounds almost like her mother might have been like, so we saw Padme basically give birth and then die at the end of give birth to Luke and Leia, and then die in the prequel trilogy. But the way that Leia talks about her makes it sound like she passed away when Leia was a little girl. And so it sounds to me like Luke was squirreled away by Obi-Wan to his relatives there, as we saw, but that then Padme should have lived and gone off with Leia to Alderaan and lived there for a time before finally dying. Long enough that Leia could have had impressions of her as like sad and beautiful or whatever else that she said. Like, as a baby, she would have known nothing. So like, all of these things contribute in the original trilogy when people are discussing stuff that happened in the past, contribute to this feeling, the sense of what the prequel trilogy would be like, that then the actual prequel trilogy we got, it checks off some of the boxes, but it doesn't quite connect, if that makes sense. And so I'm left feeling like each one in its own right is an interpretation of Star Wars, of the Star Wars universe, but they don't quite hook up properly. They don't. To me, they're different continuities because the connections just don't feel like they quite match. The plugs feel a little bit off. And so the overall flavor is, yes, they're both carrying electricity, where electricity is being Star Wars, but they're also not quite aligned. They don't quite match. So that's why I describe them as being different continuities, because I just don't feel like that they line up fully, and that like things that are talked about in the original trilogy don't quite connect properly to things in the prequel trilogy, and as a result, vice versa, right? So it's interesting to think about, and hopefully it's given you something to think about too. So until next time, everyone, take care. Bye-bye.